When the police stopped and humiliated a middle-aged bus driver in front of his passengers, they thought no one would object. But the children on the bus, witnessing the injustice, did something that no one expected. Their act of courage set off a chain reaction that would ripple far beyond their small town, challenging authority and inspiring a wave of change. The morning had begun like any other for Robert Harris, a bus driver in a quiet, working-class neighborhood. He had just picked up the last group of children on his route, the familiar chatter and laughter filling the space inside the bus. Robert loved his job. It wasn't just about driving. It was about the kids, many of whom came from tough circumstances. He saw it as his duty to create a safe and welcoming space for them, at least during the short ride to and from school. He knew each of their names, their quirks, and their dreams. He took pride in being someone they could rely on, someone they could trust. That morning, as the bus moved through a quiet stretch of road, a police car began trailing behind them. At first, Robert thought nothing of it. Police cars often patrolled the area, and he had always taken care to follow every traffic law. But then, the lights flashed, and the siren let out a sharp wail. The sound immediately silenced the chatter on the bus. The children exchanged nervous glances, unsure of what was happening. "What's going on, Mr. Harris?" asked Sophie, a quiet girl who always sat near the front with a book in her lap. "I don't know, Sophie," Robert replied, his voice calm despite the sinking feeling in his chest. "Stay in your seats, everyone. This will just take a minute." He pulled the bus over to the side of the road, the police car stopping just behind them. 2 officers got out, both wearing stern expressions that sent a chill through Robert. He had dealt with situations like this before, moments when his skin color seemed to speak louder than his actions. But he hoped this would be quick, that they would see he was just a bus driver doing his job. One officer, a tall man with a shaved head, approached the driver's side window and rapped on it sharply. Robert rolled it down, keeping his hands visible on the steering wheel. "License and registration," the officer demanded, his tone curt. Robert nodded and reached slowly for his wallet and the bus's registration papers, which he handed over without a word. The officer examined them with a frown, flipping through the documents as if searching for something to question. The second officer, a shorter man with a thick mustache, walked around the bus, peering inside through the windows. The kids watched him, their expressions a mix of curiosity and fear. "What's the problem, officer?" Robert asked, keeping his tone polite and measured. The officer didn't answer immediately. Instead, he handed the documents to his partner and said, "Step out of the vehicle." Robert hesitated. "May I ask why?" "Step out of the vehicle," the officer repeated, louder this time. His hand moved to the holster on his belt, a clear warning. Robert sighed and unbuckled his seatbelt, glancing at the kids in the rearview mirror. "Stay calm, everyone," he said before stepping out of the bus. The officer led him to the front of the bus, out of the children's line of sight, and ordered him to place his hands on the hood. The cold metal pressed against Robert's palms as he complied, his heart pounding in his chest. "Is this really necessary?" Robert asked, his voice steady despite the anger simmering beneath the surface. The officer ignored him, patting him down in a manner that felt more humiliating than precautionary. Behind them, the kids had moved to the windows, their faces pressed against the glass as they watched the scene unfold. A few had taken out their phones, recording the encounter. "Why are they treating Mr. Harris like that?" whispered Jamal, a boy sitting near the back. "It's not right," said Eric, his voice shaking with anger. "He didn't do anything." One of the officers, noticing the children recording, stormed back to the bus and yanked the door open. "Put those phones away!" He barked. "No," Jamal said, standing up with his phone still held high. "We have the right to record." The officer's face darkened. "Sit down and turn that off, or I'll—" "That's enough." Robert's voice cut through the tension, firm and commanding. The officer turned back to him, his jaw tightening. "They're just kids," Robert said. "Leave them alone." The officer hesitated, his hand hovering near his belt, but the other officer intervened, placing a hand on his partner's shoulder. "Let's wrap this up," he muttered, though his tone was reluctant. After a tense exchange, the officers returned Robert's documents and let him go, but not without a final warning. "We'll be watching." Robert climbed back onto the bus, his hands shaking as he gripped the steering wheel. "Everyone okay?" he asked, his voice softer now. The kids nodded, their expressions a mix of fear and determination. "We're fine, Mr. Harris," Jamal said, but that wasn't right. Robert forced a small smile, though the weight of what had just happened pressed heavily on his chest. "Let's get to school," he said, starting the engine. By the time they reached the school, the kids had already shared the videos they had taken. Within hours, the footage had spread across social media, sparking outrage. Parents began calling the school, demanding answers. Activists and community leaders picked up the story, organizing protests outside the police station. By the end of the day, the hashtag Justice for Robert was trending nationwide. At first, Robert was overwhelmed by the attention. He hadn't asked for any of this. He just wanted to do his job and take care of the kids. But as he watched the outpouring of support from his community, he realized this was about more than just him. This was about every person who had ever been treated unfairly, every child who had to grow up too fast because of the injustices they witnessed. The following days were a whirlwind. News crews arrived at the school, interviewing the students and their parents. Protests grew larger, with people carrying signs that read, "Protect our drivers," and "No justice, no peace." Robert attended a few of the rallies, standing silently at the back as speakers called for accountability and change. He felt a mix of pride and discomfort, unsure of how to handle the spotlight. One evening, Jamal showed up at Robert's house with a sign he had painted himself. It read, "Our driver, our hero." He handed it to Robert with a shy smile. "We're with you, Mr. Harris," he said. "We're not letting this go." Robert felt a lump rise in his throat as he placed a hand on Jamal's shoulder. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "That means more than you know." The pressure on the police department grew, and eventually, they released a statement apologizing for the incident. The officers involved were placed on administrative leave pending an investigation, but the community wasn't satisfied. They demanded systemic changes, not just symbolic gestures. Robert found himself at the center of a movement he hadn't asked to lead. He spoke at town halls and community meetings, sharing his story and advocating for reforms. Each time he stepped up to the microphone, he thought of the kids on his bus, the reason he had stayed calm that day, despite the humiliation. He wanted a better world for them, one where they didn't have to grow up fearing authority. Months later, the protests began to bear fruit. The police department implemented new training programs focused on de-escalation and implicit bias. The officers involved in Robert's stop were fired, and a review of similar incidents led to additional changes in policy. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a start. Through it all, Robert kept driving his bus, picking up the kids each morning and dropping them off each afternoon. The ride felt different now, heavier with the knowledge of what had happened and what it had sparked. But it also felt hopeful. The kids were more vocal, more aware, and Robert could see the seeds of change taking root in their young minds. One morning, as Jamal climbed onto the bus, he handed Robert a small pin shaped like a star. "You're a hero to us, Mr. Harris," he said. "Don't forget that." Robert smiled as he pinned it to his shirt. "Thanks, Jamal," he said, his voice steady. "But the real heroes are all of you. You stood up when it mattered." As the bus rolled down the familiar streets, laughter and chatter filled the air once more. For a moment, everything felt normal again. And in that moment, Robert knew they were going to be okay.